Hey friends, welcome back to the Adventures of Blink. I am of course Blink and you can find me on GitHub right here. Now I want to make sure you remember, if you get something out of this video, please click the like button. That lets me know that you found something useful, you learned from it, you engaged with it in some way that you found valuable. And that helps me decide what kinds of content come next. So if you like the direction things are going, a like helps it keep going that way. If you don't like the direction it's going, the lack of a like makes me think I might need to change it up. In addition, I'd like for you to make sure you hit the subscribe button as well. Now, subscribe has a totally different purpose, and that's to make sure you don't miss any upcoming episodes. You see, on the Adventures of Blink, we go through an entire season that's a contiguous story. And so when you go through the story, you don't want to skip over an episode. You want to make sure you got all the content along the way. So subscribe makes sure that you stay attached to anything that happens and you get notifications when there's a new episode ready to deliver. All right, so last week we learned how to take our code from our local machine and push it up into the cloud. And we did this in two different tools. We're trying GitHub and GitLab. They're more or less equal as far as what they're capable of doing at the high level, but I figured this would be a good way to expose you to the idea that you need to check out the tools and see what sort of nuances fit your model better. So we're going to experiment with both throughout the rest of this season to see how we can collaborate in each one of them. But there's a little note to consider about collaboration, and that is that it can be dangerous if we don't lay some ground rules and set a strategy for what we're going to do. The reason is because if I invite you into my project, you immediately have all the access that I do. And that can be scary because you might push code that doesn't need to be pushed, especially if you're going to invite anonymous people to contribute to your project. You need to figure out how you're going to do that safely, because you never know when somebody's just trying to be nefarious and they're going to inject some sort of malware into the project. And if you're not careful about that kind of thing, your project then gets hijacked to become a vehicle for malware being installed on people's PCs. And that's not the way you want to be remembered. So anyway, if we're going to set up a strategy for how our Git repositories are able to be used by collaborators, we have two major strategies that we should consider. The first is that we could use forks. Or we can deal in protected branches. Okay, so a fork is when someone makes a full copy of the entire repository in their own space, makes their edits there, and when they're satisfied with their changes, they can request to merge it back into the main copy. It's done at the repository level, and that's the important distinction here. The reason that this is important is because it minimizes the number of people that you have to make as a collaborator or a contributor to the project. You control it by letting anyone in the world be able to fork the project, but you're only going to accept the merge requests back in from trusted code or code that you've had a chance to review. This is a really great strategy to use if you're doing something like an open source project that you're going to launch into the cloud and it's going to be on the internet for anyone to contribute to. Because you don't have to give any people who want to contribute access to your code. They can just make the fork, which is sort of a public option. As long as the repository is publicly available, then forks are automatically part of that. Anybody can fork a repo and go do other stuff with it. But that gives them sort of a free way to get started. They can jump in there and they can make their changes and they can play to their heart's content in their own copy. And when they're satisfied with their results, if they think they've done something valuable, they can request that you merge that back in. That's what that would look like. So let's take a look a little bit at what forking looks like in a project. In order to learn about forks, we actually need to have someone else's repository available. I could use the ones from last episode that I created, but I wouldn't actually be able to fork them because those repositories exist in my namespace. I can't have a fork of my own repo. GitHub says well, that's yours already. You don't need to make a copy. Just work on it, in your space, create a branch or something. And so it thinks for me a little bit there and it blocks the ability to fork. But let's take, for instance, the Olama project. We used Olama back at the end of season 1 as we were building some AI tools. It turns out to be a really fancy free way to try out different large language models. And so if I were going to be a contributor to the Olama project, I could go over here and I can't actually make changes to this repository. I don't own it. But I can come here and make a fork. And so when I create the fork, I can choose the name that I'm going to use in my personal namespace, which generally we keep them the same as whatever the root project is. It's just easier to know what goes with what, and it cuts down confusion. Naming is hard, but it's something that we should be consistent about. But GitHub asks me for a few options here, and do I want to only copy the main branch or do I want to copy all the branches? Well, generally speaking, if I'm going to work on somebody else's project, I'm not going to necessarily want all the other branches. I'm going to fork from main and make my change and then submit that back and let them figure out how to merge. So I usually leave that checked. You don't have to. If you're working, deeply with someone on this thing, or you're part of a committee that you're not necessarily getting contributor access to the code, but you want to be able to follow along with a lot of different work streams, you might choose to copy all the branches. But I'm just going to grab main for today. We'll hit create fork. And now inside my projects, like it takes a moment here while GitHub does its work, but it's now created an entire copy of this, and you can see there's a tag on it that says it's forked from the Olama project, and you can see that this one exists in my personal namespace. And so now I have this copy of Olama that I can start to use here. Let's head over to GitLab and see how it works there. So on the GitLab screen, obviously GitLab has a different series of repositories, and not everybody posts all of their code to GitLab that posts to GitHub. It's sort of a one or the other. So I just looked for the term first contributions to see if I could find a project that might be worth checking into. So here I found some code. Most of this is just documentation about how to contribute to an open source project for the first time. And so if I were going to fork this, I could create a new fork and I could do all the same things that you saw done on the other side. I pick out which namespace I want things to live in. I can change the project slug. I can have the project name be something different and work all that out. I can choose whether I bring all branches or just the master, so I do that. I can choose whether it's going to be private or public. And as I walk through all of this, I now have the fork project button, and it will think for a moment. And as soon as it's done, and there it is, I've finished the fork, and I now have my own copy of this first contributions repo. You can see where it's forked from, just like you could in GitHub. And when I create branches and push things into it and make changes, there will be prompts that say, hey, we'd like you to consider merging this back to the main repo that you forked from. And so that becomes another step on the path. If you think of this like daisy chaining Git repositories together, the primary repository is now the parent of a forked repository. And the forked repository is the parent of my local copy that I pull down to my laptop to do work. So I make the changes and I push them into my local copy, and then I push those up to my forked repository, and from there I can request to merge those back into the main repository. So that's the flow of activity, as it were, when you're dealing with forks. It's important to realize that I won't be able to show you the entire chain of events of getting the code pushed out because I don't actually have any code changes that are ready to go for any open source projects that I don't own. So I can show you the steps that you would do to get it into the forked version, but I won't be able to show you the final step to get it back to the main repository. Newsflash, they're not really different. It's just the same steps that I would use in my local that are then applied from my local back to the main, but I won't actually be able to take the steps today. So Before we really move on to discuss the other strategy, we need to take a brief aside and talk about the idea of a pull request. It's also called a merge request, and it really depends on which cloud tool you're using. GitHub will refer to this action as pull requests, and GitLab will refer to it as merge requests. You'll often see it abbreviated as PRs or MRs, depending on which tool you're in. But it's all the same concept. It's just been labeled differently by different folks. All right, so we're going to make a change to our repository. Here we've got just the code that I've been using for the previous examples of the previous couple of episodes. And we're just going to make some changes here to say, instead of season 3, episode 4, we're going to do season 3, episode 5, and we're going to say this is our change. Okay, and we're going to save that file, and then I'm going to do git checkout-b because I want to create a new branch, and we're going to call this E5 for episode 5. Okay, so we've made the E5 branch. You can see down in the left where we're showing that we're on E5. We're going to do git commit-am E5 update. So we've made our E5 change. We've got a new branch here called E5 where our change is stored, and we're ready to push this up to our Git repository. So the first thing I'm going to do is a git push. And remember, we had 2 remotes before. So we had a GH for GitHub and a GL for GitLab. So I'm going to push this change. I think all I have to do, because I'm on the E5 branch, is just git push GH. And that's right. So it's going to create a new E5 branch in my GitHub. Now, before I go check the browser and look at this stuff, I'm going to change this and do a GL as well, so that we get it on both sides, right? And so let's go look at our repository. Over here, you can see I've got a note from GitHub that says E5 had recent pushes as of 1 second ago. So there's a change that's already been pushed up. And on this side, it doesn't give me an alert right up front, but if I refresh, I do have a note here that, okay, that's the last change that was recorded. So the question is, I do have an E5 branch. So there's one difference to consider. GitHub is going to give you live updates. When a branch gets pushed to, it's going to pop an alert on the screen, and you saw that right here. It says, hey, I noticed this branch made a change just a second ago, where GitLab does not give you that sort of feedback. So that would be something to consider just as a difference between the tools. You may find that irritating, you may find that helpful, it's up to you. But something to keep in your pocket as far as what the differences are between these two tools as you use them. So in both cases, I now have code in a branch, and I can see here, like, well, I need to refresh the page in order for the branches to refresh. But yeah, I've got an E5 branch here, and if I go over here, I was looking at an E5 branch there. So in GitHub, the thing that allows you to move code from one branch to another, to merge things around, is called a pull request. And so you can see it up here on the little badge. It gives you the option to do a pull request directly from this. And so I'm going to go on ahead and do that, and it's going to notice it knew that E5 was the branch that made the change, and so it says, hey, that's where you're probably coming from. And it looked around and said, well, the only place you have to go to is main, so I'm going to pick that. Generally, it'll pick main by default, even if you have a bunch of other branches. But you can choose different branches here. So as you're manipulating your code in certain ways, you may choose to group concepts together before they get delivered. Those kinds of things are totally doable. It's just a matter of changing drop downs here. And so I can say, hey, I'm updating for episode 5. And there's my pull request. Now, right out of the gate, this pull request, I can go on ahead and create it, and it's going to make an object in here that says, this is my pull request window. And so I've got several different things going on here. First of all, it says you're not conflicting with the base branch, so it didn't detect a merge conflict. If there were a conflict, I would have to go figure out how to resolve it before I pushed it into my branch. So there's that to consider. Over here on the right, I've got things like reviewers. assignees, labels, projects, milestone development, all sorts of ways that I can tag and categorize, as well as I can insist on people providing reviews. So if I'm working with a team, I want other people to review my code for me, right? And if they're making changes, I want to be able to review their code. So out of the box, it's always optional. There's nothing that's required to set up there. But what I want to do is take you up here to the settings tab. And as the owner of a repository, you get the ability to create branch rules and things like that. So I can go down here to my branches section and I can add a rule set. And I can say main reviews. And by doing this, I can actually turn this on where it will force me include default branch. And the rule that should be applied, if I come down here, let's see where it is. Restrict creations, restrict updates, restrict deletions, require, here we go, require a pull request before merging. So I want to choose this option, and then I want to say I need to have one approval. Now, I'm not actually going to set this because I can't then demonstrate the process of merging for you. If I do that, then I have to have a second person involved. And that's what required approvals actually means. This is approvals from people other than the person who made the change. So if I create the pull request, somebody else has to be the approver. That's the way you want to think about this. So in a group setting, this is really important because then if I'm working with my team, I can have anybody on my team come along and be the approver. But that means that somebody else on the team has reviewed this code before it went live. 2 of us looked at it, 1 of us wrote it, the other person approved it. And so we have that safety net to say, hey, we're making sure that nothing got broken. So that's where you would set this. Again, I'm not going to actually do the setting because if I do, then it locks me out from being able to push any code in this repository unless I get somebody to collaborate. So we'll just skip over that for the moment, but that's where you would go to set that. Now here, the way that would work is that you would go like to the files changed window, and then even though I haven't set the rule, I can still provide a review. So this is how you would do it. You would come in here and say, hey, looks good to me, and you would hit approve and do your so because I'm the author, I can't approve my own pull request, but this is where the option would be to do that. Now this screen shows you the different files that have changed, and it says, hey, I noticed that you deleted that title s3e4 to GitLab and replaced it with s3e5. And then you added 2 new lines below that. One is blank and the other is the this is our change line. So it gives you that view. You can also look at this in terms of which commits were brought in. So if you're really meticulous about naming your commits, they'll show up here. And you can use that as a way to see. And then you can actually go into each one individually and see what was part of those commits. But let's just presume that the approval is already done. Of course, I can't show you that because it's my repository and I'm the only one in here. So if I were to do that, or if I were able to do that, then you would see me show up here as a reviewer, and there would be a little check mark to say it's been approved. You can also force the system to ask for certain people to review certain things. So there might be, you would put a configuration file in your repo called a code owners file, and you would say this folder is owned by this person and that folder is owned by that person. And that way, if you're breaking out responsibility for things, you can actually control who has to provide approvals in each case. But those are all additional things, and again, without being able to actually show you this stuff, I can't set it up this way because it would just lock my repository down and then I wouldn't be able to actually demonstrate anything. So let's imagine that all of that has happened and we've gotten appropriate approvals and everyone's happy. I'm ready to hit merge pull request. And so here you can see I'm ready to confirm the merge, and there it goes. It has now merged the E5 branch into main. So my main branch now contains the change, and we should open up main and look at this real quick. So I'll open a new tab, and we can see on main, this is our change shows up, and we're looking at episode 5. So it's successfully merged everything in. And back on my pull request, I actually have a quick option here to delete the branch that it came from. This is important because you want to clean up after yourself. You don't want a bunch of branches just dangling off your repository forever, and you're never keeping track of them all. Now, technically, the Git log is still going to contain all of this information. It's not being like removed permanently, but cleaning it up here means that you won't have it in the dropdown. You won't have 50 branches to have to sort through to find the one that you're going to update next. So for example, you'll see now that I've done that, when I go back here, main is the only branch that shows up in this list. Now, if I go to view all branches, I can actually go to the, oh no, it fully deletes at that point. So I misspoke. It's actually going to do a complete deletion there. But there you go. You've now been able to push code up to the Git repository into a separate branch and then merge it into main. This is important because it means that you have that requirement to put things in main. And by protecting the main branch, you can prevent unauthorized changes, or at least unapproved changes, from going up. So let's head over to GitLab and see what it looks like to do this same operation there. In GitLab, you remember we call this something slightly different. Instead of a pull request, it's called a merge request. And so if we're going to make a change, we would go into the E5 branch, and there's where the little banner pops up. It says, hey, you pushed to this branch 10 minutes ago. And so you can create a merge request off of it to be able to do this with. So merge request, and we go through the process. We've got the ability to assign someone to be the reviewer, things like that. I'm not actually setting any of that up right now, but you can actually try it for free. So let's take a quick look. Oh, well, I've got to go through a sign up process. Never mind that. But you can create all of those same settings that we saw in GitHub. You can do the same kind of thing here in GitLab to say, I want this branch to be protected, and I want it to require a pull request in order to merge into it, or I'm sorry, a merge request in order to merge into it. And because I've set those things up, I've now created a guardrail that allows me to protect my main branch from any unapproved changes. So last step here is, of course, create the merge request, and it's thinking about it, and here we go. It says, oh, look, there's no pipeline here. We'll look at pipelines in a later episode, but that is a feature of GitLab that allows you to actually go through a full deployment process. I can't remember if that's next week. No, it's probably later on in the season. We'll go see how all this works later on. The short version is you have some options there that we'll go explore. But it says, hey, we're ready to merge this. Now, do you want to delete the branch? Do you want to squash all the commits together into a single commit to keep your commit history clean? And do you want to edit the commit message to clean it up? These are some options that GitLab gives you as you're preparing to merge code. I'm going to skip all of that for the moment, and I'm just going to hit merge because we want to see that happen. And we did actually delete the source branch. So now you can see that this has been merged into main. So E5 was merged into main in the GitLab environment as well. Now, if I go back over to main, I can see the changes in there. And when I go in here, my branch has been deleted. So there you are. You've now been able to merge in both environments. And we've seen some minor differences between the two. Well, that was pretty awesome, wasn't it? We're able to continue coding using our Git command line tools to be able to build a branch, add commits to it, and push that branch up. But once it's been pushed up into the web tool, we have the ability to use the web UI to shepherd our code through its merge process until it gets into our main branch, which we would think of that as production. That's what collaboration in Git looks like. You want to be able to manage it easily, and you want it to be wildly visible to everyone on the team, because the more things that are hidden from different team members, the harder it's going to be to keep yourselves in sync. All right, so I want to make sure that you remember to tune in next week as we go beyond the code and explore some more of the features that GitHub and GitLab make available to you. They're not coding related features so much as they are just development lifecycle helpers. And so we're going to look at some of those extra tools and see what kind of cool things we can do. In the meantime, make sure you're clicking like if you learned something today. That helps me understand that you got something good out of this and helps me decide what kind of content comes in the future. Make sure you're clicking subscribe so you don't miss any upcoming episodes. And I can't wait to see what you build. So we'll see you next time.